This is 11.3 Heart Physiology Notes. The essential question is, what is the proper order of events that causes blood to flow in and out of the heart, and what is the order of the intrinsic conduction system? During heart contractions, both the atria, the left and the right, contract simultaneously or at the same time, and the ventricles contract at the same time. When the atria, left and the right atria, are contracting, then the left and the right ventricles are relaxed. And vice versa, when the left and the right ventricles are contracting, then the atria, the left and the right atria, are relaxing. The term for muscle contraction of the heart is systole. It's the contraction. Usually when we're referring to systole by itself, it refers to the ventricular systole. Diastole refers to relaxation, and unless it says atrial diastole, when they talk about diastole, it is the relaxation of the ventricles. Cardiac cycle is an event of one complete heartbeat, and there are several phases. Starts off with the mid to late diastole, which means that the ventricles and the atria are in the middle and the late phase of relaxation. This is the time when the ventricles are filling with blood. Immediately, as soon as the ventricles are filled with blood and the pressure is built up, then causes the ventricle wall to contract and cause ventricular systole, and blood is pushed out into the blood vessels. Specifically, the left ventricle will push out blood to the aorta, and then the right ventricle will push out the blood through the pulmonary artery, or the trunk and the artery. Next, the early diastole is the beginning portion of the relaxation of the ventricle and the atria. The atria will fill with blood, and the pressure in the ventricle is the lowest because this is the time right as soon as the ventricles have emptied, and then it is beginning to relax. Showing in the first picture, notice to the mid to late diastole, the ventricles are filling with blood. So that means that the atria is already filled with blood and the pressure is high. So the atrioventricular valves on either side will open up and the blood will fill into the ventricles. And eventually they will fill up. And the filling up of the blood is caused by the contraction of the atria. Second phase is ventricular systole, which means the ventricles will eventually fill with enough blood and cause a pressure to build up, which will close off the atrioventricular valve, and then the ventricles will contract and then force the semilunar valves open, and then the blood will fill into the blood vessel. Number 3 is the early diastole. This is the time when the pressure inside the ventricles are the lowest and the atria is in the phase of filling up with blood. Here's another diagram showing more detailed events of what's happening during a cardiac cycle. So starting at the beginning, when there is an atrial systole, the atria, the blood right and the left atria are filled with blood. And then when they contract, it will force open the atrioventricular valves, and then the ventricles will fill. And remember that soon as the atria contracts, then it's going to relax and go into diastole, and then at that time the ventricles are in systole. Enough pressure, blood fills up into the ventricles and causing enough pressure to force open the semilunar valves, and then causes the blood to exit out of the ventricles and then into the blood vessel. As soon as the ventricles are emptied, then the ventricles are in the early diastole, where the pressure is the lowest. At that moment, at the same moment that the ventricles are emptying, the atria are filling with blood. And then in the last picture here, the ventricles are in diastole, and the atria are again filling with blood, and then it will start the entire cycle over again. It is important to note in the center, notice that it starts off with the atrial systole, which means the atria are filled with blood, and it contracts to empty the blood into the ventricles. And while the atria are in diastole, at the same time, it is the ventricles are in systole, which means they are in contraction. As soon as the ventricles are in systole, after the ventricles have emptied, then it reaches the ventricular diastole, and then the cardiac cycle repeats over again. When listening to the heart, there are two distinct sounds that are heard. The first sound, which is slightly longer, is called the lub, and it is the closure of the atrioventricular valves. Remember, the right and the left side of the heart work together, so both the tricuspid and the mitral valve are closing at the same time. The second sound is a slightly shorter sound and is a dup sound, and it is caused by the closure of the semilunar valves, the aortic and the pulmonary semilunar valves. So there should be two distinct sounds. So if there is maybe more than two sounds, then that means that the right and the left side of the heart are not contracting at the same time, which could cause problems. The cardiac output is the measure of the amount of blood that is pumped out by the heart in a minute. Cardiac output can be calculated by multiplying the heart rate and multiply that number by the stroke volume. The heart rate is how fast the heart is beating, and it is measured in beats per minute. And the stroke volume is the volume of blood that is pumped by each ventricle in one contraction. So when you multiply those two numbers together, that will tell you the total amount of blood that is pumped out by the heart. The intrinsic conduction system is the internal control for the heart rate. So there is external control of the heart that is created by the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system of the autonomic nervous system, but the heart has its own system of regulating the heart rate. The elements of the intrinsic conduction system is the SA node, which leads into the AV node, then leads into the AV bundle, which leads into the bundle branches, which leads into the Purkinje fibers, and then to the ventricular wall. The SA node stands for sinoatrial node, and it is known as the pacemaker. It is located at the right atrium, and this is what starts the heartbeat and sets the pace for how fast the heart is going to beat. Usually, if you have a defect in the SA node, that's when they put in a mechanical pacemaker into the heart that basically sends an electrical impulse that kind of starts off the heart rate. From the SA node leads into the atrioventricular node, and it is at the junction between the atria and the ventricle. Then the network of nerves leads from the AV node into the AV bundle, which is the atrioventricular bundle, or it's also called the bundle of His, and it is located in the right and left bundle branches. So the AV node leads into between the two ventricles, and it branches out, and it is located in the intraventricular septum, which is the wall separating the ventricles. Then that leads into the Purkinje fibers, and Purkinje fibers are specialized, the muscle layer, the myocardial layer, and that conducts the electrical impulse throughout the myocardium and within all of the muscles in the ventricular wall. So the heart contraction starts at the SA node, which is the pacemaker. Then it shoots out electrical impulses to the left atrium. So there is a slight earlier contraction of the right atrium before the left atrium, but because it is so fast that you can't even detect any difference in the left and the right contraction. Then from there leads into the AV node. then the contraction leads into the intraventricular septum, which is the atrioventricular bundle or the bundle of His, and then it leads into the bundle branches. It splits, and then the Purkinje fibers are the specialized cells within the muscular wall, the myocardium, that spreads out, and then that leads into the ventricular wall muscles. So always the contraction is going to start at the right atrium and then the left atrium together, and then it's gonna contract toward the middle, and then it's going to contract the ventricular wall up. So it's atrial contraction, ventricular contraction, atrial contraction, ventricular wall contraction, over and over again. Regulation of the heart rate. So there are many ways that you can control the how much blood can be pumped out of the heart. So one way is to change how much blood is pumped out by the ventricles. But the stroke volume is kind of the same. Unless you can change the size of the heart and increase the volume inside the ventricles, you can't really control the stroke volume. Because the Starling's law is basically the more the heart muscles can stretch, then it's going to be able to create a stronger contraction. But the cardiac muscles, it has a limit to how much it can stretch and how forcefully it can contract. So the only thing that you can really change is how fast the heart beats. So the faster the heart beats, you're going to pump out more blood. The slower the heart beats, then the less amount of blood you're going to pump out. This is what controls the cardiac output. So that is one way to regulate the heart rate. Other factors that increase heart rate is obviously the sympathetic nervous system. In times of emergency or crisis, it's going to increase how fast the heart is going to beat. Also, hormones or neurotransmitters like epinephrine and thyroxine can increase the heart rate. Physical exercise can also increase heart rate. And also, if there is not enough blood in the heart to pump out, then it's going to increase the heart rate to try to get more blood out. So you can affect cardiac output by how fast the heart beats, because cardiac output is the multiplying how fast the heart beat by how much blood that it pumps out. So in a crisis, when someone is hurt and there's a cut and they're losing blood volume, then initially the heart rate will go up because your body is still trying to pump more blood out of there. But eventually what's going to happen is you're going to run out of blood, and then eventually the heart is not going to have any blood to pump out, then it's going to slow down. So that is what is meant by decreased blood volume. Factors that can decrease heart rate is parasympathetic nervous system is going to slow down the heart rate. Having high pressure in the blood vessels will also cause the heart rate to go down. Or having too much blood coming to the heart can also cause the heart to decrease. And what can initially, when there is a loss of blood, your heart rate will go up because your body is trying to pump out more blood. But eventually the blood volume is going to go down, so which means you have less blood coming to the heart, and eventually if there is no blood for the heart to pump, then it will stop pumping blood. And so that's what decreased venous return means. The less blood comes back to the heart, then there is less blood to pump, so it's going to decrease the heart rate. 11.3 notes homework. Number 1, what do diastole and systole mean, and during which do the chambers of the heart fill and empty? Number 2, list the order of the intrinsic conduction system. Number 3, what factors affect heart rate?